How's it going, everybody? Adrian Simple and Katosepe here, Gaming Observer Radio. It is November 22nd, 2019, and we are here today to talk all about Half-Life Alyx. That's A-L-Y-X. This will be their newest game, and it's releasing exclusively for virtual reality, where it will be their quote-unquote flagship VR title. It's going to be a fully fleshed out game. It's $60, and it's releasing March of 2020. There's a whole lot to consider when it comes to the release of this. I think there's sort of many branches of this tree, and we kind of want to take a look at all of them today. Now, personally, I haven't played any Half-Life before, and I was only about 9 years old when the last one came out. So, Kato, I guess you're going to have to be the one to sort of cover the story side of this one.
I got this.
But before we get into that, I just want to talk more about, like, sort of at an overall industry level. So just give me your thoughts on it.
To say there's going to be a new Half-Life game, and then to say it's going to be exclusive to VR is a huge thing. And I think, to some extent, a lot of people expected this, especially when Valve started making their own VR headset. A lot of people, I think, expected that to be when Half-Life 3 was going to be announced. But then it didn't. So now we're here, But yeah, exclusive VR Half-Life is a huge, huge thing.
It has a lot of implications, right? When Gabe Newell before had said that they're working on sort of 3 projects of a fully, full game, and I think a lot of people did imagine that at least one of those was VR. And yeah, if you're having something like Half-Life and you decide to put that IP on it, and you're going to call it your flagship VR title, obviously this is meant to be a really big deal. Because they've taken their IPs in the past, with Portal, they've said, they had that Bridge Constructor game, I forget what it was exactly, but it was kind of just like a spin-off of the IP. And they very easily could have done something like that with Half-Life. They could have just said, yes, this is a Half-Life game, and it's like a $20 experience. It's not necessarily a fully fledged game. But to say, this is what it is, it's this big, in-depth, Half-Life experience that you're used to, and then not calling it Half-Life 3, I think there's a lot to look at there.
It's true, and I think it might show a lack of faith in the game. I think we both have other theories about what that may be, but that was my first concern when I saw the trailer, was Half-Life Alyx, and it's going to take place in between Half-Life 1 and 2. It seemed like a half step, no pun intended there. And that had me concerned. That had me really concerned, actually, at first. But I think there may be more to it, and I'm excited to get into that.
Yeah, see, I kind of took, like, the opposite perspective. Like, I saw this, and then maybe I had that, like, initial instinctual reaction, like, why isn't this Half-Life 3? But then the more I was thinking about it, I was thinking they could have very easily just called this Half-Life 3 and taken the cash grab, the marketing grab, right? They could have said, like I said, they're calling this their flagship VR title. Why not just call it Half-Life 3 because they can? Which means that maybe this is just false, Valve hope that we've had for the last 20 years. That so much of the gaming community has been sort of clinging on to, just kind of resurfacing now. But I think if they weren't planning, or at least weren't considering the idea of Half-Life 3, why not just call this 3?
They have to be considering it. There's no way Valve has just, decided to stick their head in the sand and pretend Half-Life 3 is not something the entire world has wanted for 12 years. They ended episode 2 on a cliffhanger. Like, they know what they're doing. And Valve's always been kind of a weird company like that. They have their IP, which is sacred to them. Portal and Half-Life, and even, Left 4 Dead, they don't want to taint those franchises, those IPs. It's so, they've always been planning it. They've always thought about it, and it's kind of interesting that now is when we're finally going to see more.
I think another sort of branch that we can look at here is the implications that this has on VR as a whole. Obviously, it's a very fledgling market. There's not a whole ton of people that are playing on VR right now. Very few people are going home every single night to play VR. Mm-hmm. And so now that we have this first sort of major game to come releasing on the platform that isn't like VR Chat or Beat Saber, an established IP that has a history. Obviously, we have to consider, are they hoping to drive hardware sales? Are they just trying to, are they seeing... I mean, obviously, they're not seeing Half-Life Alyx as necessarily profitable as a game itself, because they're giving it away for free for anyone who owns any part of a Valve Index. So to some extent, they're trying to drive hardware sales. But to another extent, I just saw this article from The Verge, and they're saying, their sort of argument that they made was that Half-Life Alyx is there to drive Steam VR user, how do I say the word? I don't even know how to say it, but like the platform of the Steam, the storefront.
Yeah.
In the same way that Half-Life was the only game on Steam when it first came out, this will be sort of the main game that entices you to go check out the storefront for Steam. Because now, especially, there's so many competing, like Oculus has their own storefront, and everybody who's making VR headsets has their storefronts. And so maybe Steam is seeing this as an opportunity to, rake in the attention span of the player.
I think that makes sense. I think it's more about bringing people into VR rather than specifically into Valve's own VR headset. Just because, like, it is nice that they're giving it away for free to people who have the Valve Index, but even with that price incentive, there are other VR headsets that it will run on that are going to be cheaper. The Oculus Quest is $400. Paying $400 and then $60 for this game is a lot less than paying, $770 for the Valve Index or whatever it's running for now.
Yeah, and I mean, the only caveat there with the Quest is that you have to buy the link that will hook up to like a gaming PC. And I think what's actually important there is that they released the minimum specs for the game. And at minimum, it's going to require 12 gigabytes of RAM and a GTX 1060 or an RX 580.
Yeah,
which is pretty hefty. I mean, there's a lot of gaming PCs that were made 5 years ago or 10 years ago that still can hold up to now, but it won't be capable of running this game.
Yeah, but that's kind of a VR mainstay also. Anyone who has at all invested in VR likely has a machine stronger than that at this point. It's high for the average gamer, but I think for the VR enthusiast, it's probably not. It's actually pretty low.
Right, and so then we start to wonder, Steam then, or Valve is then looking at this as driving this game to the market that already has VR and not necessarily raking in new customers.
It's fair. It'll be interesting to see what happens in March if people are going to go out and buy VR. Because I do think when they have said this is their flagship title, I think honestly that holds true for the entire VR industry. Like, VR has had some big name games, but nothing even close to this level. And
go ahead.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see if VR headsets sell, if this is what people have been waiting for. But you're right, like, people are going to need some beefy computers, and it's interesting. It'll be interesting to know how many people have those computers and just haven't invested in the headset yet.
Well, and you mentioned a great point as well. Like, I think I've made this comparison before, but how many people bought a PS4 for Marvel's Spider-Man? You were one of them. I had two friends myself who, had other consoles and still just got the PlayStation for Spider-Man because that drove the hardware sales. Half-Life is obviously something people have been clamoring for so long. Is another experience like this where they're promising a full experience going to drive the hardware sales? I think it's totally possible.
It's absolutely possible. If anything's going to do it, it's going to be this.
When you look at the games that have sort of released from Valve recently, we look at Artifact, and then I think the only other real thing is Dota Underlords. Before that, you're looking at Dota 2, right? Back in 2013 or whatever it was.
Right.
Do you think Valve is the type of company that sees the launch of Artifact and says, not necessarily we have to make up for this, but we need to sort of come out strong again?
This is purely my speculation, but I think Valve is really unconcerned about it. Like, I think they treat their IPs very delicately, like Half-Life and Portal. But as far as trying out new games or just developing new things, I think Valve can fall back on Steam whenever they want. I think they're one of the few companies in gaming that really is unconcerned by the thought of failure, of risk. Artifact was a bummer, but it's not hurting Valve at all. They're just fine. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think so too. Yeah, and I think from the gamer's perspective, like, it doesn't matter even what games had released before, even if they had released 5 flops in a row. If Half-Life Alyx comes out and it turns out amazingly, that's all people are going to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is just me, but I would rather have a company that is willing to experiment than one that only releases, the big name AAA games.
Yeah, of course. Even if those, I think part of the reason why these IPs are valued so highly is because we only get sort of a snippet of them every few years, especially when it comes to Half-Life.
For sure. I mean, everything I've heard from Valve, it sounds like their employee base is mostly split off into teams based on what they want to work on. So it's impossible to know because they don't announce it, but I would guess Valve cancels more games than they release. I'm guessing they have canceled tons of games in the last decade, and we've only seen, 2?
Yeah, that's something that, so Jeff Keighley of the Game Awards did a sort of a sit-down interview with some of the developers, and that's something that they brought up, is that a lot of people have this perception that Valve went off and they stopped developing video games. They just sort of focused on the money of Steam and whatnot. But that, in fact, they were making a lot of projects that they were just throwing out the window because it wasn't good enough or whatever it was. And now we have a glimpse of something that started as kind of a vertical slice of a VR game. Like, they were just interested in making a VR game in 2016. And this is something that they said in the interview with Keighley. Mm-hmm. And then this eventually evolved into, hey, if Half-Life 1 was about revolutionizing the story aspect of first-person shooters, and Half-Life 2 was about the gravity gun and the physics engine, then why isn't the next Half-Life entry something revolutionary once again, and that could be VR?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they've always talked about Half-Life as being the thing that they won't make a third until they have a good reason to do so. They're not just going to push a sequel out, and I think that's held true. They've never really done just iterative sequels.
Right, so now that we've kind of looked at all of that, let's, like I said, I'm not very familiar with the lore or the story or anything like that. What is what is happening here, and what's your interpretation, or you've also been kind of cynical of it. So where are you approaching this from?
When I first saw it, like I said, I was a little concerned. I was excited, absolutely. I mean, we haven't seen Half-Life in 12 years since Episode 2. Half-Life 2, Episode 2 in the orange box. And so I'm going to definitely be excited. But I did have some yellow flags here. The fact that it's not a sequel, at least on its front, was concerning to me. They ended, for those who have played the games, Half-Life 2 Episode 2 ends with a major, major cliffhanger, and we've just never seen anything since. And I think that's a big reason why people have wanted Half-Life 3 for so long, was because it just ends with this horrible cliffhanger. So for it to come back 12 years later and potentially not address that is very concerning to me. I don't mind Valve experimenting. I like experimentation from game developers, but to just ignore the cliffhanger we've been left on was worrying. And then, like we talked about, the fact that they're calling this Half-Life Alyx and not Half-Life 3, I just was worried. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've watched the trailer probably 7 or 8 times now, I'm really hopeful for it. And the main reason is actually the last line that you hear in the trailer, which is from Alyx's dad. And I hope we're all okay getting spoilers for a 12-year-old game. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the game's old. Yeah,
cool.
Just go for it.
So, yeah, if you don't want
just
spoilers...
a spoiler warning for everybody listening. The game is 12 years old, and incredibly famous game. But if you do not want spoilers for Half-Life, just, skip forward a couple minutes.
Yeah, and we're going all the way up to the end of Episode 2 here. So, okay. So, the last line of the trailer is Dr. Eli Vance, which is Alyx's dad. And he says, "Close your eyes, honey." You can hear him say that in the trailer. It's the last thing. those were actually his last words at the end of episode 2 before he is killed. So it's interesting, and I can't even imagine this being an accident. The fact that the game is supposed to take place between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2, it doesn't really make sense for them to have Dr. Vance's last words in there, because it's not supposed to have happened yet. So my theory, and I'm bringing in some outside sources here, but I think it was a year ago, maybe almost a year ago now, there was a leaked script that was apparently supposed to be what Half-Life 3 was going to be, right?
Well, I believe that was a blog post from the writer who had left Valve.
Right, and it titled Epistle 3, and using gender-swapped names, but I think the general consensus was that was the idea for Half-Life 3, right? I mean, it was pretty thinly veiled. So if we take that into account, one of the elements of that game was apparently going to involve time travel. And I am curious if that is still the case. I could potentially see Half-Life Alyx being a lead-up to Half-Life 3, in the sense that she has been made aware of what is going to happen in episode 2, and the story might involve her trying to avoid that. And I also bring up the line right before that in the trailer, where it sounds like a Vortigaunt is talking about how Alyx Vance cannot avoid her fate. So I'm wondering if trying to change the future is going to be an element of this game.
All right, very cool. I think I'm very interested in playing through those games finally at some point. I think I tried at some point in my teens, but like I said, the last game came out when I was 9, so it had to be like an effort for me to really go and play it.
They're worth it.
All right.
I mean, they're a big deal in first-person shooters. I think the first one is a bit harder to play these days, just because we have evolved so much in the shooter landscape. But I think to this day, Half-Life 2 stands up really well.
Oh, and that's another aspect I think is really interesting is seeing these trailers with like thoroughly modern graphics and seeing like the G-Man as like a currently rendered model was really kind of a weird perspective to see in this trailer, because we've been talking about we've been seeing Half-Life for so long and talking about Half-Life for so long. The strength of that story it has been evanescent over the last 12 years. And with all the visuals of that come the old textures, right? And so to associate the brand new graphics with the IP has been kind of, very strange.
It's a good feeling. I love seeing the updated models. Seeing the G-Man show up at the end there is just, I can't even explain to somebody who played, or for somebody who played Half-Life back when it first came out. It's been, has it been 20 years now?
Yeah, 1998, I think, or something like that.
Oh, I feel old, but
yeah, that's when I was born.
Well, now I feel older, thank you. But seeing that is just, it's fantastic, and even though he doesn't even say anything, just his menacing glance is enough.
Okay, so there you go. That's Half-Life Alyx. Obviously, lots of moving parts there. I think this is going to be really interesting to watch play out, right? We looked at Artifact. Like, I was really excited for Artifact because we had Hearthstone, we had Magic the Gathering coming up with their own sort of multiplayer card game online, because previously they didn't really have a solid foundation. And I was really excited for it because I thought, yes, Valve, they're coming in with, guns a-blazing and they're going to really sweep the market. And then, obviously, it flopped. And then with Dota Underlords, like, that's a similar process where they took a mod of a game that existed and then sort of turned it into their own thing. Obviously, that's something that they're really well known for. And they found success with Dota Underworlds, but probably not the same widespread success that you would see with things like Dota 2 or CSGO or things like that. So now, maybe just we'll see something with Half-Life Alyx, especially with, all the nuances that come with VR, and especially they're opening up the game to modders and to workshop developers to create new maps. And I think that was a really smart move. And I think that actually tells a lot about how much weight kind of they're putting into this game. If this was just going to be something they threw away, I don't know if developing workshop, capabilities would be something that they would want to take the time to do.
Yeah, it's impossible to overstate the impact the Source engine has had on gaming. And while it's not used very much now, it's very dated now. The Source 2 engine, if that is released to everybody for use, not just as a modding tool, but if people can just play around with Source 2, that's going to be a huge thing for gaming.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, fingers crossed on that, right?
Absolutely.
So I guess that's going to wrap it up for today, unless there's anything else you want to touch on before we go.
I just think it's going to be fascinating to see how things play out. I mean, good, bad, mediocre, whatever. We're going to be starting the decade off strong. This is going to be a very interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, no kidding. This is like 4 months away, which is really, like, it came out of nowhere, and then now here we are. We've got, like, it's within sight, and I think that's really fascinating. No, that's just so exciting, right? I got so giddy when all of this was going on, and that's the first time I felt so giddy in a while.
Absolutely. Well, it's probably the biggest thing to happen in VR, like, since VR. So
yeah, like since Beat Saber exploded.
Exactly. It's going to be interesting to see how many people buy into it.
Okay, well, that's going to be all for today. I want to thank you very much for tuning in, and I'd also like to say thank you to all of my patrons who make this show possible, especially Brandon and Mando, who subscribe at the producer tier. You can find Katosepe at videogameoftheday.com, and I'll be back tomorrow with your daily news. Until then, happy gaming, everyone.
Happy gaming, everyone.